it would be hard to categorize most of what we see going out over the airwaves these days as news. People are isolated into political camps, and people within each political camp is simply told what they want to hear before they even approach the evidence for themselves. How did this actually happen? What we have to do is look at how things were right after World War II, when they changed, and why. Journalists start to pursue what gets rewarded. And what gets rewarded is not honesty, but rather drama. Nothing can be an isolated event anymore. Everything has to be connected. You know, if you've ever turned on the news anytime in, let's just say the past decade or so, you've probably noticed that the news today is different, to put it nicely. And in fact, it would be hard to categorize most of what we see going out over the airwaves these days as news. What we see these days, most people experience as a rather explicit attempt to engage our emotions and to push viewers towards enragement and anger. And this has been the theme for a long time, progressively, pretty much throughout my entire life. A lot of people feel this way, and it turns out that if you feel that way, you aren't actually crazy. Because the news networks themselves, when pressed on this, will actually admit to it, as long as there is sufficient money on the line to motivate them to tell the truth. Probably the most famous example of this type of admission came out during the 2020 US presidential election and all the media chaos that surrounded that, with a very famous character named Tucker Carlson. Maybe you've heard of him. Tucker Carlson is perhaps the single most famous news commentator in the entire United States of America, and he is extremely influential. The last I checked, his podcast was like number 3 or number 5 on all podcasts across all of Apple in the United States. He is a very influential person, but during the 2020 US presidential election cycle, Tucker Carlson was on trial for defamation. A lot of people haven't heard about this, but during the trial, the news agency was forced to admit to something that was actually quite damning. And it goes beyond just this individual news agency, but actually implicitly speaks to the media infrastructure inside of the United States as a whole. What happened was that when Tucker Carlson was on trial for defamation, he was provided lawyers by Fox News, the network that Tucker Carlson was a part of at the time. And the defense that his lawyers came up with was essentially this: Tucker should not be held liable for defamation because anybody who watches his show knows very clearly that the things that he says are not meant to be taken seriously. And anybody who watches his show knows that the things he says on his show are not necessarily factual. Now, this is a rather interesting defense to make because if you've ever met anybody who watches Tucker Carlson on a regular basis, that is in fact the opposite of what their attitude and opinion is. Most people who watch Tucker Carlson, especially the ones that I have met, actually believe that everything that Tucker Carlson says is extremely factual, and a lot of them take it as gospel and are not willing to hear any criticisms of his arguments. But nevertheless, this was the argument that Tucker Carlson's lawyers made, and it turns out that the judge in this case agreed with this argument in a statement that few people have heard, but that is extremely telling about the news landscape in the United States of America. And I don't want to get this wrong, so I'm actually going to read several snippets of what the judge said word for word, although they are snippets, they're not the entire statement, because that would just take too long. When commenting on Tucker's case, the judge said, "Given Mr. Carlson's reputation, any reasonable viewer arrives with an appropriate amount of skepticism." She also said, "This overheated rhetoric is precisely the kind of pitched commentary that one expects when tuning into talk shows like Tucker Carlson Tonight, with pundits debating the latest political controversies." And finally, the judge said this: "This general tenor of the show should then inform a viewer that Carlson is not stating actual facts about the topics he discusses, and is instead engaging in exaggeration and non-literal commentary, word for word End quote. Now, I don't think I need to explain that. That is pretty damning commentary. And I'm also not just picking on Tucker Carlson here, because the way that the judge said this in this case implied a much larger scope of issues. Tucker Carlson was not let off for defamation because what he said was true or was not true. That wasn't even really considered. But instead, the judge determined that Tucker Carlson shouldn't be held liable for defamation because the political landscape in the United States is so overheated that anybody engaging with news media, and in particular pundit-based talk shows, should just expect when they go into it that they are not going to be told the truth. And this was actually used as a legitimate legal defense. What this case really speaks to is about what industry standards in the United States have become when it comes to media, and particular when it comes to media talking about important political issues, which is arguably the most important media there is, because that is the media that informs the public and pushes them in one direction or another to make important decisions about who they elect for office, who makes the laws, and where the country goes now and in the future. And apparently the industry standard for that category of media, even according to judges within our own country, is you should not expect the people doing these discussions to give you factual information. And in fact, the implicit thing is it's actually a little bit ridiculous to even expect factual information or to be told the truth. When it comes to these political commentators who shoulder immense responsibility, when they get overheated, the standard is apparently that they are to be given a free pass, because getting overheated and saying incorrect things is just sort of what they do, which is kind of like giving a toddler a free pass for throwing a massive tantrum just because they're a toddler, and that's what toddlers do. Whether that's right or wrong, that is how the political landscape is in the United States. Now, unfortunately, while what happened in this particular case was actually a massive deal, the unfortunate truth is that not a lot of people even heard about it, especially not Tucker's fans, who needed to hear it the most. And a large reason for that was that, unfortunately, Tucker's opponents, in response to this case, did the exact same thing that Tucker was accused of doing. They took the details of the case, which were damning as they were, and they decided these aren't damning enough. We are going to push things further than reality. We are also going to exaggerate things because, again, people don't come to us for factual information, and we can't be held accountable for not providing factual information. And so the opposing media took this Tucker Carlson case and they pushed it way too far in a way that was, of course, jubilantly accepted by the people on that side, but immediately dismissed by the people who already loved Tucker Carlson. The people who already hated Tucker Carlson, they heard the details, they took them further than reality, and they said, oh, what a horrible guy. But the people who loved Tucker Carlson saw how insanely exaggerated the case was, and they just dismissed everything about the case outright. They threw the baby out with the bathwater. They threw out the false claims while also throwing out the true claims. This case then is a fascinating example of political science and also human psychology and sociology. Because in this case, we not only see cold hard evidence of the fact that we are not even expected to trust our media, but we also see, in essence, why the media has become so untrustworthy in the first place. Because they are rewarded for it. We see in this case how people are isolated into political camps. And people within each political camp is simply told what they want to hear before they even approach the evidence for themselves. And their opinion is already fully established and fully formulated before they've even heard any details. We see people being very untrusting of the other side and not even really being willing to hear the other side. And so the question that I want to explore in this video is, how did this actually happen? How did we become this way? And is there any hope of us getting out of this? What we're going to see in this video is that this process is really hard to escape, but the factors that led to it are coming to an end. On one hand, that's comforting. On one hand, that's disturbing because there is a chance that it could get replaced by something even worse. I'm going to go into all the details, so let's dive in. I want to start today's analysis, as I do a lot of different analysis, around the time of World War II. And this analysis is going to center on the progression of American media, but what you will find is that the things that I discuss are not just applied to American media. They can be applied to media in almost every other country, even in countries with a free press like we have in the United States. And to see that progression, what we have to do is look at how things were right after World War II, when they changed, and why. So after World War II, media in the United States was pretty much institutionally centrist. People didn't really take a hard stance right or left, and that wasn't because people didn't have stances right or left, but rather it was because of the form that media took at that time, which was television or radio, where there were very few channels on either of those things, and media had to appeal to a mass audience. You had to appeal to the entire country in one way or the other, so you did not take a very strong opinion. Media was surprisingly neutral at this time. It might not have felt like it back then, but contrast it to what it is today. And we had very famous news commentators at the time, like Walter Cronkite, who pretty famously rarely took opinions on any issues. The approach to news was pretty much, we're just going to give you the facts, and that's it. Now, at this time, the media could get away with this and was even rewarded for this approach because at the time, media did not have a whole lot of competition. Television and radio were very new things, and when it came to programming on all these networks, news was some of the only dedicated programming that was there on a consistent basis. There wasn't much competition. And so people would go to the news, whatever it was, when there was dead space in their regular programming, when their favorite show wasn't on because things were on a schedule. And so news would just kind of fill the dead space, and they didn't have to do anything special. That all started to change as more television shows emerged. And it all started to change very aggressively when the internet emerged. And all of a sudden, people had all sorts of other opportunities to entertain themselves other than the news. Now, speaking of change, I've just had to relocate under some trees because a rainstorm just blew in on top of me. Life in the mountains, I guess. But anyways, as the media landscape began to change with the internet, people had a lot more entertainment options available to them. They could choose from a number of different shows accessible at the time they wanted it, not just at the time it was programmed. They also had access to more and more options for video games, social media, even things like MP3 players where they could spend their time listening to music. And when it came to digital media, there was just way too much competition. As this happened, people started to find the news rather boring, and news networks found it really hard to get people's attention, to get people to watch and care about all these events that often had very little to do with them. So the news media started to change very explicitly to try to make kind of boring daily events seem really exciting. And the way that they did that was that they abandoned their neutral approach and they began to divide themselves into networks with target audiences. You had networks that were focused on the left, and you had networks that were focused on the right. And as they began to divide into target audiences, they realized that they could go really far down a rabbit hole for these particular viewers because viewers from the other side were never going to watch them anyways. And so the focus of the news media became, hey, let's try to make things as engaging as possible for our specific target audience. And the way that we do that is by making everything somewhat conspiratorial, everything somewhat insanely dramatic, so that benign daily events are now very exciting, and maybe they're even about me. A really good example of this is, again, I'll pick on Tucker Carlson again, because I've already probably gotten in trouble with Tucker Carlson fans, so they already don't like me. But I'll pick on Tucker Carlson again, because he is a great example of this. where if you look at some of the stuff Tucker Carlson was putting out back in the 2020s, early 2020s during the US presidential election, he was taking very benign events and making them as conspiratorial as possible in ways that have since been obviously shown to not be the case. And I'm not talking about the big conspiracies, I'm talking about little things. For example, I remember an event where an airplane crashed into a food supply area, a food supply factory, which makes sense because if you think about agricultural land, it's these vast empty spaces where a lot of crop duster planes go, and the only structures around for them to hit are the food factories or the food processing facilities that are there to process the food that's being grown. And yet Tucker Carlson took this event and he basically implied that there was somebody, the ephemeral they, that was trying to attack America's food supply. And I don't know why they're doing it, but it's really bad. The government's out to get you, that sort of thing. Now, this is just one example, but this was how the news networks changed to win the war for attention by making everything as crazy and as dramatic as possible to isolate a set of viewers and keep that set of viewers coming back because that was the only way. Under this approach to news, journalists start to pursue what gets rewarded. And what gets rewarded is not honesty, but rather drama, which is how we can get to the point where even a judge says, yeah, when people watch the news, they don't expect honesty, and that's a little bit ridiculous to expect that. And so what we see, again, are these big grand narratives where nothing can be an isolated event anymore. Everything has to be connected. There's no such thing as simple things, like simple human incompetence, simple human selfishness. There is now no longer even isolated events of human evil, but rather every single thing that goes on in our world is connected to a grand narrative. And the reason this is because to appeal to a national audience, you have to make everything about a national narrative that encompasses all of them. If a plane crashes into a food facility in Idaho, generally speaking, typically that would only attract the attention of people who lived around that area in Idaho. But if you want to get everybody engaged in that, you have to make it part of, again, a national conspiracy. And the media was quite successful at this on both sides and making everything far more dramatic than it really was. Another reason that this worked so well with the media is that now the news became incredibly emotional to the point where people would talk about the news with their friends on a regular basis and with their family on a regular basis. People say there's two things you don't talk about, religion and politics, and that's because people always love to talk about religion and politics. But it gets uncomfy, and so we don't like to, but we really do. We talk about it all the time. And when you have these extremely emotional narratives and people are going out and talking to it about their friends or family, now the friends and family get the feeling like, well, this is kind of crazy. Maybe I should be more informed. Maybe I should be spending more of my time watching the news instead of living my daily life. And so this actually gives the networks a mechanism to grow their audiences in this day of extreme competition. And it works, but it only works to a degree. And the reason that I call this the dying gasp of the legacy media is because while this is allowing them to protect their profits today, all of the way that this has happened does mean that the media in the form that we know it today will not last forever and cannot last forever because it's simply not profitable anymore. When we look at legacy media, we see that they are losing profits big time because people are frustrated with this approach. Most people don't like this approach. And so people actively disengage from the media. In fact, surveys show that I think in the United States, 40% of people actively avoid the news. Now, this isn't people who just aren't interested in the news. These are people who actively avoid the news. Like, we see the news come on, we turn it off immediately because we don't want to hear any of that. 20% of people in the United States, approximately 20%, are actively engaged with the news. And so what that means is that the news media has created an environment where there are twice as many people who will try their hardest to avoid it as there are who will actually pursue that intentionally. And then the other 40% of people kind of casually will watch the news here or there. They don't actively avoid it, but they're not super passionate about it. They'll probably just watch it when there's an event that catches their interest. Now, the problem is that at this point, the news networks are in too deep. So they know that people don't like what they're doing. But the problem is that for them to continue making money, they have to continue the system as it is because it's the only way to keep the audience that they have left engaged. And so what they do is they pursue increasingly, every year, increasingly dramatic narratives, increasingly dramatic conspiracies. And the problem with that is that it isn't just people watching the news media, but that actually spills over into real life, where people take these dramatic narratives and they live them out with dramatic actions. And we see examples of that all the time in the news too. So now you really have three camps of people. You have the really hard right, who's really engaged with right-wing news media. You have the really hard left, who's really engaged with left-wing news media. And then there's everybody else who is too afraid to even touch any of those positions. Now, this is terrible for political progress for two main reasons. First of all, the people who are actually interested in politics are extremely polarized, and everybody else now has an incentive to be actively disinterested in politics. And so there's no honest conversations going on about how to actually move our country forward. There's just people kind of not wanting to step on the wrong issue and kind of walking on eggshells as they talk about their own personal opinions. And none of that is a recipe for people actually coming together and coming up with solutions that actually push our nation forward. And as long as that attitude continues, really the only thing that can happen to a nation with a news media landscape like that is that that nation will regress. It could happen quickly, it could happen over time, or more likely it will happen in quick spurts that are distributed over time. So there will be quick moments of regression followed by moments of stagnation. Now, while that's all really discouraging, what might be encouraging is that this current landscape is time limited because the legacy media is definitely dying. In the United States, the average age of people who watch the networks is getting progressively older. They're not getting any new young people to watch them. They're just retaining the older people who have watched them since they were kids. The average age of a viewer of Fox News is now 68 years old. And so we will come to the point where the people who engage with these networks literally die off, and because they are unsuccessful at getting other new people to engage with them, they will have no other path to go. That is on top of the fact that people not only are disinterested in the news, but they're also just cutting cable in general. Fewer than 50% of US households now even have cable to watch cable news, whereas before it was close to all US households, or at least a vast majority. So the news networks, as we know them today, are going to die out. And the question is, what happens then? What do they get replaced with? There's really a couple options here. First, if the news networks are no longer able to get sufficient audience attention to sell ads to be profitable, they will be more and more inclined to seek alternative avenues towards profit. And that means aligning themselves with specific political interests or specific business interests and telling the narrative that the people who pay the bills want them to tell. We already see that to a certain degree, but that could become much more explicit and much more corrupt. But even as that happens, they're still losing eyeballs. And so we will probably see that happen, but it won't be the ultimate outcome. Instead, what will happen is what is already happening. People will stop turning to cable news and giant networks to get their information. They will start turning to people like me. Now, of course, for me, that's a great outcome, and I look forward to that. And yet I am also integrated enough in my space and honest enough about what goes on around me to know that there are a lot of risks involved with this approach too. They are different risks. They are different problems, as well as some of the old problems, but they're problems nonetheless. The risk that we have as more and more people distrust the large networks and turn more and more to independent news, like you see on YouTube and things like that, is that the independent people in a platform like YouTube don't have the resources that these large networks have. And so they just cannot do the same level of reporting that a large network can provide. Even what I do on my channel, I don't actually do reporting. I do analysis, where I take information that is provided by proper reporters and I connect the dots to analyze things. Because as an individual, I don't have the capacity to go out and individually report on things. And so as we start to lose the old news media, it will be harder and harder to get access to basic facts, basic information. And without access to basic facts and basic information, it will get easier and easier for people to spread disinformation, whoever wants to do that. And people will find probably on social media that they are rewarded in the same way that the legacy news networks have been rewarded for spreading disinformation. And people will do this without integrity. And instead of having a couple major networks that we can all point to and say we can see and analyze their actions and we can take them to court, we'll have thousands of independent actors who, a lot of them, will probably just get away with bad things and never really be held accountable for it. Now, I understand all this facts. I operate with a level of personal integrity, and I don't want to do any of these things myself, but I'm not stupid. I know that there's going to be a whole lot of people who operate without integrity that enter this landscape. At the same time, we're going to get pushed down the same rabbit holes that we've gotten pushed down by the legacy news media, where they're divided into two camps. That's not going to go away, although it might get lessened a little bit. And that's because of social media algorithms. These algorithms are optimized to feed us content that we will engage with. And so they are optimized to send us content that we already have a proclivity to agree with. Now, this is a little better than the legacy media because you still have to click on that content and make a conscious choice to engage with it rather than it just being fed to you. But the problem still persists. It's just a little bit less. Although the good thing about all of this is that as we are entering a new age of media, we can do so with our eyes open wider to the risks and account for that in a certain way. And maybe we can make intentional choices to not be so isolated into one camp or the other. So if I were to summarize this video quickly, I would say it like this. You're not crazy. The media really is not telling you the full truth because that's not what they're incentivized to do. But you're also not crazy. The media is getting punished for that approach and they won't be able to do it forever. So what we need to think about now is the direction the media is going into the future and how can we implement guardrails? How can we implement practices to ensure that the problems that the media has created over the past generation don't get replicated for the next generation? Now, that is part of why I am doing what I'm doing on this channel, trying to be an early adopter who tries to set the standard for this space with integrity, with at least a somewhat neutral approach and a fact-based approach to examining the issues that impact us every day. So if you appreciate that approach, before you go, if I could just ask you for a quick favor, I am an independent analyst. I don't draw a paycheck from a newspaper or from a news agency of any kind. And so if you would like to support the work I do here, you can do so by becoming a patron. It's completely voluntary, but it's just something you can do to help support the work I do here on this channel. And it also ensures that because I'm supported directly by my audience, I have an incentive to tell the truth. Because if people don't like what I'm doing and I start going off the guardrails here, people will no longer support me and I will no longer have a job. And in that sense, that's the first really good guardrail in this new media landscape. Hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.